Hello, today we're going to look at the sequester and the fiscal cliff in some detail. The first thing we really should put in context is what we're talking about. And if you look over the next 10 years, there are really two directions fiscal policy can go. The first direction is this top blue line with $2.3 trillion worth of deficits over the next 10 years. And that's the Congressional Budget Office baseline, their projection for where we would be if there were no changes to current law, Congress and the President just left Washington for 10 years and left things as they are. And that really is actually a pretty benign outlook for the deficit. You can see that deficits go about to zero, almost a balanced budget by the end of that budget window. And so really, if we follow current law, our next 10 years, we're in pretty good shape. Now, there's this red line down here of a $9.7 trillion in deficits over the next 10 years, which is a much worse outlook. And that's the outlook if we follow current policy. If we extend the tax cuts that are scheduled to expire, we don't cut spending through a sequester, we don't do physician payment relief, AMT relief, all of these other things that are in current policy that we tend to always do. If we continue to do them, then deficits stay in the trillion-dollar range every year, and we have a pretty bad outlook for the next 10 years. So the debate over the fiscal cliff is really this debate between those two lines. Do we follow current policy, or do we follow the current law? The reason following current law is a problem is because you get into some economic issues with such a short-term amount of deficit reduction while the economy is still recovering. Let me just go over some of the orders of magnitude of these different things making the difference between current law and current policy. So to get from that 2.3 trillion to 9.7, you extend the tax cuts, which is about $3 trillion. You extend the AMT, you fix it so it doesn't keep ensnaring more middle-class taxpayers. Congress has been doing that. If they continue doing it, that's another $2 trillion. And then there are other tax cuts that are about $1 trillion. So that's $6 trillion just in tax cuts that are scheduled to expire. And then you have the spending changes where you assume we don't stick to these hard discretionary spending caps and we don't do the trigger, and then some other smaller things. And that's about another $1 trillion worth of changes. And that's how you get from the current law to the current policy baseline. Now, the fiscal cliff is really what happens just in 2013 with all of those changes. And you have about $560 billion of deficit reduction just in the fiscal year 2013, about 7 months of the calendar year 2013. And you can see, again, the expiration of the tax cuts is the largest factor there. And then there's some of these are going to have more immediate economic impacts than others in terms of the recovery. But what the CBO has said is that if you allow all that deficit reduction to take place, you wind up slowing economic growth to the point where you enter a recession again in the first half of 2013. So you would have a contracting economic situation of about 1.3 percentage points of GDP compared to growth of about 5.3 percentage points of GDP if you extended all these things and didn't have such large deficit reduction. So that's the cliff. It's really an economic cliff that happens. You fall off it if you allow so much deficit reduction in such a short period of time. Now, the trigger specifically, the sequester is coming up, were the result of the Budget Control Act in August 2011, which allowed us to extend the debt ceiling. It had a very complicated formula dependent upon a super committee to reach bipartisan agreement, which they didn't do. And so you have these triggered cuts, and it's divided equally among 10 years. It's about $109 billion of across-the-board cuts a year for the next 10 years. And those are divided about half and half between defense and non-defense, but then there are some programs that are exempted, like Social Security. A lot of Medicare spending is exempted, and some other programs are exempted. So what you wind up cutting is further cutting discretionary spending. About 71% of the cuts from the trigger is in discretionary spending, a little bit of mandatory spending, and then interest savings. so the net result is that you've spent a lot of time cutting non-defense discretionary spending. You've also cut defense spending as well, but if you look just at the non-defense discretionary spending, you're actually cutting below any level we've seen really in the modern budget era, where if you include the sequester and the caps that were passed last August, you wind up cutting that part of spending down to about 2.5% of GDP relative to, let's say, the lowest level since 1970, which was just over 3% of GDP, and then the historical average for the last 30 years has been closer to 4% of GDP. So really a very large cut in this one part of the budget. But you can also see defense spending is projected to shrink down to about 3% of GDP from the Afghan and Iraq war high of about 4% from the late 2000s. So the real issue, though, is that we have this long-term budget challenge where you have the debt that's going to rise from about 73% of GDP up to about 225% of GDP by 2040. Of course, it'll never reach such heights because the economy will collapse before we get there. So the real key is how do we start slowing that growth of debt? And that's going to take some long-term reforms because if you look with all these sequesters and budget caps, most of the spending of the government that we're talking about, this non-defense discretionary spending and defense spending, really is projected to shrink over the next 20, 25 years, while Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, those mandatory spending programs, are projected to really grow dramatically, as well as interest on the debt. And so these mandatory spending programs have been largely untouched by any of this budget effort, including the sequester and the Budget Control Act. So really, we're still left with wanting a solution to this long-term budget problem that we haven't gotten yet. And one of the solutions has been called the Simpson-Bowles proposal. It was a fiscal commission set up, reported with a bipartisan majority at the end of last year. And what they do is that green line is the same as the red line that I showed you, debt going up to about 225% of GDP. They found it bipartisan agreement to cut spending and to raise revenues to reduce the long-term debt trajectory down to below 60% of GDP in just 30 years, because they really attack all areas of the budget. And so the hope among budget watchers, at least, is that this fiscal cliff and the need for action to avoid going into recession from all of that deficit reduction in a short period of time will drive members of Congress to finally get together and develop some long-term plan to attack the growth of the debt. And they can do that by picking and choosing from Bowles-Simpson. There are other bipartisan recommendations, but the real key is that everything has to be on the table. We really have to look at restraining mandatory spending growth, and we also have to look at getting new revenues into the government, and that's what they do. So when you see your members of Congress on the campaign trail, you want to ask them some key questions and have some data to back it up, and to make sure that they're not just telling you things that aren't true or just trying to tell voters what they want to hear. So we have a key questions pamphlet on our website that'll arm you with the facts and figures that you need to really ask some serious questions of your members of Congress and your candidates for political office. So with that, I wish you luck, and hope we can answer some questions for you in the future.